All right, we left off in Isaiah chapter 37. Isaiah 37. And we're in the middle of the historical section in the book of Isaiah where Sennacherib and his armies invade Judah. This would have been in about 701 BC. And Sennacherib has first sent his messenger, Rabshakeh, to taunt the people who are in Jerusalem, basically to tell them that none of the other nations, their gods haven't saved them. Your God's not going to save you either. Hezekiah, he can't be trusted to help you. So you all should just come out and surrender and avoid the siege altogether. And then, to add insult to this, Sennacherib himself sent Hezekiah a letter saying pretty much the same thing. Do not let your God in whom you trust deceive you, saying Jerusalem will not be given into the hand of the king of Assyria. Behold, you have heard what the kings of Assyria have done to all the lands, destroying them completely. So will you be spared? Did the gods of those nations which my fathers have destroyed deliver them, even Gozan and Haran and Rezeph and the sons of Eden who were in Telassar? Where is the king of Hamath and the king of Arpad and the king of the city of the Sepharvaim and of Hena and Eva? And Sennacherib's argument is essentially, look at history. We're undefeated. No one's ever going to beat us because no one has beaten us. So you all should just surrender. Stop trusting in your God, Sennacherib says. And Hezekiah's response to this is to go once again into the house of his God and to pray and to petition God for help. He does not appeal to his own goodness or righteousness. Rather, he appeals to God's not allowing them to blaspheme his name. He tells them that, yes, the Assyrians are right. They destroyed these other nations and those gods weren't powerful enough to defeat them because they were gods of wood and stone and gold and silver. They're idols, and the Assyrians just cast them into the fire. They were not gods, but the works of men's hands, in verse 19. But, verse 20, O Lord our God, deliver us from his hand, that all the kingdoms of the earth may know that you alone, Lord, our God. Unlike the dead idols that were thrown into the fire, Yahweh is a living God. He is alive. We just sang about that. Well, after Hezekiah prays this, Isaiah comes with a message, and this is where we left off last time. And I want to read here in verses 21 through 29. It's set off as poetry in my Bible, this part. Isaiah the son of Amoz sent word to Hezekiah, saying, Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, because you have prayed to me about Sennacherib king of Assyria, this is the word that the Lord has spoken against him. She has despised you and mocked you, the virgin daughter of Zion. She has shaken her head behind you, the daughter of Jerusalem. Whom have you reproached and blasphemed, and against whom have you raised your voice and haughtily lifted up your eyes? Against the Holy One of Israel. Through your servants you have reproached the Lord, and you have said, with my many chariots I came up to the heights of the mountains, to the remotest parts of Lebanon. And I cut down its tall cedars and its choice cypresses, and I will go to its highest peak, its thickest forest. I dug wells and drank waters, and with the sole of my feet I dried up all the rivers of Egypt. Have you not heard? Long ago I did it. From ancient times I planned it. Now I have brought it to pass that you should turn fortified cities into ruinous heaps. Therefore their inhabitants were short of strength. They were dismayed and put to shame. They were as the vegetation of the field and as the green herb, as grass on the housetops is scorched before it is grown up. I know you're sitting down, and you're going out, and you're coming in. You're raging against me. Because of your raging against me, and because your arrogance has come up to my ears, therefore I will put my hook in your nose, and my bridle in your lips, and I will turn you back by the way which you came. So what does Isaiah have to say about the Assyrian boasts in these verses? What kind of message is he giving to them? They're boasting about things they didn't even do, right, Jenna? Yeah. I mean that's basically the problem here in a nutshell is, look at all this stuff I did, Assyria says. And you can read the Assyrian annals. This is I mean, this is very much this description in verses 24 through 25, where he talks about all these different things I did. I conquered this place. I went up to this place. I did this. It's very much like reading an Assyrian king's conquest records. But God says that the problem with that is this assumption of, you think you're claiming credit for that? Really? No, God says, because long ago, verse 26, I planned it. Isaiah is kind of, this is kind of a taunt song in many ways. And we saw something like this in chapter 14, if you remember, when Isaiah was talking about the king of Babylon and his defeat. He talks about how, you thought you were going to exalt yourself up to heaven, and God has done what? He has thrust you down to Sheol instead. He has destroyed you. And all the nations are going to look at you and wonder. And it's like, wait a second, was this the king that was so powerful? Was this the king that forced all of these nations into captivity? Was this the king that took so many prisoners? And now what does he look like? He is a source of astonishment because of how the mighty have fallen. Well, that's very much what Isaiah is getting at here in chapter 37 as well. It's the same kind of taunt song. The daughter of Zion, in verse 22, she has despised and mocked you. The Assyrians are going to be despised and mocked by the daughter of Zion, which is kind of the opposite of what's happening right now. Rabshakeh and Sennacherib, they're mocking Zion. But Isaiah says there's a time coming when it's going to be reversed, and those roles are no longer going to be that way. You've raised your voice. You've lifted up your eyes. Those terms that we've been talking about for being lofty and exalted, I've mentioned them a few times in this Isaiah class. But here in verse 23, it's those same two words, Ruma and Nasa. Against whom have you raised your voice and haughtily lifted up your eyes? Now, does man have a right to make himself lifted up and exalted? No, the Lord of hosts alone is lofty and exalted. So they're lifting up their eyes against the Holy One of Israel, but they don't have the right to do that. No, they boasted like this. We see that Sennacherib is in for a rude awakening. Have you not heard? There's an expression that will pop up later in chapter 40 in verses 21 and 28. Do you not know? Have you not heard? Has it not been declared to you from the beginning? God is the one sitting above the circles of the earth. He sees what's going on. And again in verse 28, do you not know? Have you not heard? The everlasting God, the Lord, the creator of the ends of the earth, does not become weary or tired. His understanding is inscrutable. What kind of God is this? Is this a God who, he fights this big epic battle and then he just gets weary and he finally, succumbs after one too many gods has come after him? No. Is this a God who's just getting tired of keeping track of all these different nations all over the place? No. He is a God who has planned it all out from the beginning. Have you not heard? Long ago I did it. From ancient times I planned it. I have brought it to pass that you should turn fortified cities into ruinous heaps. There's only one reason why Sennacherib has conquered so many cities and why the Assyrian Empire is so mighty and great. And that is because God planned it. And God established it, that would be what happened. He established it long before there was any real thought or mention of them. Yahweh claims credit for the Assyrian conquests. So really, he's kind of turning Sennacherib's criticism on its head when you think about it. Sennacherib's saying, none of the other gods can defeat me. What makes you think your God can defeat me? And Yahweh says, well, I've been helping you defeat all those other gods the whole time. I've been doing this the whole time. Now you're going to criticize the one who has given you power. You've come up to Mount Zion and you've taunted the Lord of hosts. Well, that's not going to end well for Sennacherib. From ancient times, I planned it. The word for planned is the same word that's used, it literally means molded. It's the work that a potter does with his hands, his clay. God has been using Assyria since day one. They are merely clay in his hands. They are merely the rod of his anger, as it says in chapter 10, in verse 5. And now, verses 28 and 29, he says, you have devastated nations, but now I'm going to devastate you. There's kind of an equal retribution thing going on. God knows they're going out. God knows they're coming in. He knows their entire battle strategy. He knows every movement of their forces. They can't hide from him. And in verse 29, he says, I'm going to put my hook in your nose. Anybody know why that's significant? Jenna? That's what the Assyrians would do to people, one of the things the Assyrians were notorious for is when they took captives, they would put hooks in the noses of their captives to lead them along. It was really quite morbid and graphic and all that. But God says, I'm going to do that to you. I'm going to take you with a hook and drag you off back to your homeland. God has given them their just deserts. There's a lot of that in Scripture where people just get their just deserts. As they have treated others, so they are treated in turn. So any comments or questions up to verse 29? Oh, all right. Verse 30, this shall be the sign for you. You will eat this year what grows of itself, and the second year what springs from the same. And in the third year, sow, reap, plant vineyards, and eat their fruit. The surviving remnant of the house of Judah will again take root downward and bear fruit upward. For out of Jerusalem will go forth a remnant, and out of Mount Zion survivors. The zeal of the Lord of hosts will perform this. Therefore thus says the Lord concerning the king of Assyria, he will not come to this city or shoot an arrow there. He will not come before it with a shield or throw up a siege ramp against it. By the way that he came, by the same he will return. He will not come to this city, declares the Lord. For I will defend this city to save it, for my own sake and for my servant David's sake. So what is Isaiah getting at here? What's he talking about? Especially in the first part of that paragraph we just read, verses 30 through 35. Don't all speak up at once. Okay. All right. All right. Yeah, that's kind of interesting. You know, the implication that you're going to be here long enough to eat crops from this kind of thing. What does he mean when he says, "This shall be the sign for you"? What's the point of that? What was a sign? Jenna. Okay, all right. You know, the prophets would do this a lot. They would make a prediction and then they'd say, and this is the sign that you know this prediction is going to come true. You know, for instance, in 1 Kings chapter 13, whenever Jeroboam is, this prophet, the man of God from Judah, comes to Jeroboam and says, somebody's going to come and burn the bones of the priests on your altars. His name's going to be Josiah. He says, and the sign that this is going to happen is that the altar is going to be split apart and the ashes are going to be poured out. And on that occasion, the altar breaks apart and the ashes are spilled out. Or you might think even of in Isaiah 7, for instance, Isaiah told Ahaz, you're not going to be defeated by the Syrians and the Ephraimites. He says, and you can ask God for any sign you want and He'll show you. And of course Ahaz refuses to ask for a sign. And Isaiah says, well, here's a sign for you anyway. And he talks about Emmanuel and says that there's a child's going to be born, a virgin, and that a virgin will conceive and bear a son, call his name Emmanuel. And before that child is grown up, before he's old enough to eat curds and honey, the land whose two kings you dread will be forsaken. Well, in Isaiah 37, we kind of have a similar thing going on here. That what's going to happen is you're going to get 2 years worth of harvest from one set of crops. And then in the third year, you're going to have regular sowing and reaping. And that's the sign he gives. Of course, what's interesting is that the sign is given after the Assyrians are defeated. Or at least chronologically, that has to be the case because it would take several years to even know that this was happening. 701 BC is how it goes. There's another promise in here that the surviving remnant of the house of Judah will take root downward and bear fruit upward. So we have a re-established remnant. You might think back of all the different passages we looked at in chapters 7 and 10 about how a remnant will return. God's always had a righteous remnant of His people, and there's always been an intent to save them. The remnant will go forth from Jerusalem. That sounds a lot like what we saw in Isaiah 2 in verse 3, where all the nations are gathered to the mountain of the Lord of hosts, and the mountain of the Lord is exalted above the chief of the mountains, and the word of the Lord goes forth from Jerusalem. God's going to do something on Mount Zion that makes everybody go, oh, wow, He really is Lord. Now, in one sense, that's fulfilled in what we're about to read in Isaiah 37. And of course, in another sense entirely, it's fulfilled when, Jesus comes and the apostles come and the Spirit is poured out on Pentecost and all that. And still, there's a future fulfillment of that as well when, we are gathered before the throne of God on Judgment Day, as all the nations, and this final word of the Lord goes out, that He is Lord. Every knee will bow and every tongue will confess that He is Lord. Jenna? You might think of, something like that, where, Jesus is on the cross and all this stuff goes on, all these different signs pointing to, this event's significant. And the Roman centurion says, surely this was the Son of God. Well, that's a big deal that he makes that, because that's a Gentile making a confession about the Son of God. In verse 33, we learn that the city of Jerusalem will not even be threatened. There's not going, Sennacherib's been trying to get out of having the siege by having everybody just leave the city. But Isaiah says there's not going to be a siege. There's not going to be a siege ramp put up against the city. There's not going to be an arrow shot here. They're not even going to get to Jerusalem. They're going to leave. Sennacherib's going to go home the way he came. It's really very much a prose explanation of what he said in verse 29. I'm going to take my hook and I'm going to drag you back. The reason Sennacherib's going to depart isn't because he remembers that he left the oven on or something like that. The reason he goes back is because God wants him to go back. And in verse 35 it says, I will defend this city to save it for my own sake and for my servant David's sake. Why is David so important here? Okay, well, Christ is descended from David. Good. Did you say something?
David established it.
David's the one that established it as the capital. You have a kind of a similar thing going on in 1 Kings whenever God is talking about His plan to split the kingdom. Solomon has upset him, and he doesn't tear the whole kingdom away from Solomon. He says, I'm going to leave him with Judah for the sake of my servant David and for the sake of Jerusalem, which I have chosen. In fact, that passage in Kings is one of the passages in Scripture where he talks more than anywhere else about how Jerusalem is the city that God has chosen to make His name dwell. So it's for His own sake and it's for its servant David's sake. Isaiah's made several references to the David promise prior to this. The whole thing about how in chapter 9, verses 6 and 7, for instance, a child will be born to us, a son will be given to us, and the government will rest on His shoulders. His name will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Eternal Father, Prince of Peace. There will be no end to the increase of His government or peace on the throne of David and over His kingdom, to establish it and uphold it with justice and righteousness from then on and forevermore. The zeal of the Lord of hosts will accomplish this. In Isaiah 11, the reference to the shoot that will spring from the stem of Jesse, and a branch from his roots will bear fruit. Later on in Isaiah 55, we see kind of the same thing. I will give you the holy and sure blessings of David. That God is protecting His people for the sake of His anointed one, for the sake of David. But Isaiah does begin to hint, especially in the later sections, that there's more to this anointed one promise than just a guy in the past who's long dead. Well, no, God's promise to give loving kindness to David forever, finds its ultimate fulfillment in Jesus, in the overturning of death itself even. We're going to see more of that as we go along. But just point it out here. Any comments or questions up through verse 35? Gail?
Regular planting, and then they would have another year where they would eat from that harvest. Then they would have regular sowing and reaping.
I might have misspoken. You will eat this year what grows of itself, and the second year what springs from the same. What did I actually have written in my notes? I'd been interpreting that to mean, that it's kind of like how, the sabbatical year, whenever God tells the people of Israel, I want you to, every 7 years, you're not supposed to plant crops. And, people are like, well, what are we going to eat that whole time? And God says, I'm going to so order my blessing so that there will be a double harvest that year, so that you won't have to sow and reap, and you'll still be eating that produce until the harvest from the 8th year comes in. So that's kind of how I was interpreting it anyway. I mean, you might be right. I don't know. You're going to have to scrounge and forage for food. But I get the impression more that this is kind of a sabbatical year type thing. God's going to provide for His people. But I don't know. I have to think about that. I hadn't even considered that approach.
Or maybe just, don't plow it under because
it's going to, I know, there might be something to that. Israel didn't do a very good job of keeping the Sabbath year in their history. They didn't do a very good job keeping the Sabbath day. And, I mean, we get that indication from reading Jeremiah 17. They were very good about keeping it in Jesus' day, but that's a little different. And so, I mean, it's...
I got it.
2 lean years. Well, your version says something different? What can you read it for us?
This year you will eat only what grows up by itself, and next year you will eat what springs up from the land. Third year you will plant crops and harvest, and you will tend them.
I have to look at the Hebrew on that. Oh, no. We're in Isaiah 37, and that was verse 30.
basically the same thing.
Yeah, well, I may have mentioned this in the last class, but everything in Isaiah 36 to 39 is pretty much exactly parallel with 2 Kings 18:13 through 19:7. There's a few minor differences here and there, but, I mean, they're very, very minor. Jenna?
So then 2 bad years and then 1 good year?
Like I said, I don't know. I hadn't even been thinking about it in those terms at all. I got to go back and look. The Hebrew may be ambiguous. Sometimes that happens. When a passage is ambiguous in English, it's because it was ambiguous in the original language.
This was the sign
Yeah.
that Isaiah see that these things are going to happen.
Yeah. Jenna, you had something?
I mean, I'm looking at it
Again, you may be right about that. I'll have to look at it. I don't know. I hadn't even... I read it one way and made an assumption. And there you go. See, there's the value of comparing translations, by the way. Suddenly you learn something. Right. Picking up, verse 36. Then the angel of the Lord went out and struck 185,000 in the camp of the Assyrians. And when men arose early in the morning, behold, all of these were dead. So Sennacherib, king of Assyria, departed and returned home and lived at Nineveh. It came about as he was worshipping in the house of Nisroch his god, that Adrammelech and Sharezer his sons killed him with the sword. They escaped into the land of Ararat, and Esarhaddon his son became king in his place. So all those promises that Isaiah has been making up to this point find their concrete fulfillment in those 3 short little verses. What becomes of the Assyrian boasts now? Yeah, it's like, 185,000 struck dead by the angel of Yahweh. The great king that Rabshakeh was boasting about must now flee back to his homeland. There's kind of a little contrast going on here in the text. In chapter 37, Isaiah goes into the house of his God twice to pray, and he is delivered. At the very end of this, Sennacherib goes into the house of his God, and he is killed. His God was not able to save him, but Yahweh was able to save. He's killed by 2 of his sons, and a third son, Esarhaddon, becomes king instead. Now, here's where it gets interesting. Sennacherib's army was defeated in 701 BC. Sennacherib doesn't die until 681. This assassination happened, but it didn't happen until 20 years later. There's kind of a gap of 20 years between verses 37 and 38. But even more than that, Hezekiah only lives 15 years after this. So Hezekiah doesn't even live to see the fulfillment of the promise of God. You think about that. What does that say about God and His promises and His providence? Do we need to be around for God to fulfill His promises? It's like Abraham. God told Abraham, I'm going to give you this. I'm going to give you and your descendants this land. Abraham didn't live to see that. Isaac didn't live to see that. Jacob didn't live to see that. He was in Egypt when that happened. Joseph didn't live to see it. But the point is that the promises of God, will always be fulfilled. They may not be fulfilled on our timetable. They may not be fulfilled in our lifetime even. But they will always be fulfilled. And the idea, because when God closes a door, He opens a window. Well, sometimes He doesn't open the window for you either until long after the fact. And I think that the real point here is, not God's providence is working out in your personal life to make, you personally happy in your realm of existence. Rather, God has a much bigger scheme of which we are a very small part, and of which, we will ultimately see the fruition of it in the resurrection of the dead. But we may not see it now in this temporal life or in this temporal realm of existence. So it's kind of a cool lesson to notice in passing that Sennacherib actually outlives Hezekiah, but Sennacherib's death is still attributed to Yahweh. Now, Sennacherib's historical record, I think I mentioned this already, but Sennacherib's historical records don't say anything about verses 36 through 38. Why not? It's a little embarrassing. What you're saying that they're so totally objective back then. There's no such thing as objective history. Or there's no such thing as objective historiography, I should say. Nobody ever is without bias in their presentation of events, and the Assyrians were no different. What Sennacherib says is this, that Hezekiah had revolted against him, that he invaded Judah, took 46 cities, shut Hezekiah up like a bird in a cage, collected a tribute, and went home. No. So, the tribute did happen, because we read about it in 2 Kings 15 in verses 19. That's Menachem. We read about the tribute from Hezekiah in 2 Kings 18 in verses 13 through 16. Now, the Assyrians were notorious for boasting and for omitting self-damaging information, so it kind of raises a question. If Sennacherib is accurate in his description, he's certainly describing something that's way, way out of line for the Assyrian policy. When you rebelled against the Assyrians, typically what they did was they burned it was rare that they left your city intact. They certainly wouldn't leave the king on his throne. He usually gets killed because he fomented rebellion against them. They were very unforgiving about that kind of stuff. What happens in 2 Kings 18 is Hezekiah pays the tribute. The Assyrians say, now that you paid us, we're going to destroy your city anyway. God says no, destroys them. And the Assyrians basically chalked it up and said, well, we won because we got the tribute. Yeah, you won, quote unquote. It's interesting, a Greek historian, Herodotus, writes about how Sennacherib's army was destroyed by a plague of mice. He's kind of raises an interesting question. He sides more with the biblical scheme of events than with Sennacherib's version of it. But Isaiah's telling of the story comes in after the tribute's been paid and shows how the Assyrian overconfidence leads to their annihilation. So which version of the story should we believe? Should we believe Isaiah's version of events or Sennacherib's version of events? And there's really no middle ground on that point. Because if Isaiah is simply recording fiction, like some people think he is, well then the entirety of the book falls apart. But if Isaiah's point up until now has been that God is the ruler of the nations, and if we believe that, we have to believe that, this is the concrete proof of that contention right there. Without some kind of divine intervention, Isaiah's words fail. And so this is Isaiah's been making this case for God throughout this book. These 3 verses right here, the whole thing that's staked on is this is what God has done. How much more can He do than we are able to ask or think? So this is the center and the heart of the book. Any comments or questions on it? All right. Chapters 38 and 39 are more, they're not as positive as these other chapters. Because even though Hezekiah exemplifies trust in God, we're going to see that Hezekiah has a couple of shortcomings. First of all, he's mortal. He's not going to live forever. And we see that in his illness that he gets. And he gets 15 extra years of life, but he becomes the main focus of this song that he writes in verses 9 through 20 about his mortality. And we also learn that he is fallible in chapter 39 in the way that he handles the Babylonian envoys. And ultimately, the promises of Isaiah are seen as only partly fulfilled because Hezekiah is not the ruler that Isaiah spoke about who would bring peace and who would put an end to all of this warfare. Isaiah leaves you longing for something more than Hezekiah. It leaves you longing for someone more than Hezekiah. an anointed one who will actually fulfill the promises of the Lord in a very real and total and final way. Someone who is immortal, someone who is infallible. And of course we understand, because we know the punchline already, that it's Jesus Christ. We know that the final end result of all of this is leading up to that. But let's put ourselves in the shoes of Israel for a second and see, now that we've seen our ruler and his trust in God, let's read this in verses 1 through 8 of chapter 38. In those days Hezekiah became mortally ill, and Isaiah the prophet, the son of Amoz, came to him and said to him, "Thus says the Lord, set your house in order, or you shall die and not live." Then Hezekiah turned his face to the wall and prayed to the Lord and said, "Remember now, O Lord, I beseech you, how I have walked before you in truth and with a whole heart, and you have done what is good in your sight." And Hezekiah wept bitterly. Then the word of the Lord came to Isaiah, saying, "Go and say to Hezekiah, Thus says the Lord, the God of your father David, I have heard your prayer. I have seen your tears. Behold, I will add 15 years to your life. I will deliver you and this city from the hand of the king of Assyria, and I will defend this city. This shall be the sign to you from the Lord, that the Lord will do the thing that he has spoken. Behold, I will cause the shadow on the stairway, which has gone down with the sun on the stairway of Ahaz, to go back 10 steps. So the sun's shadow went back 10 steps on the stairway on which it had gone down. All right, so there's a couple of comments in here, actually. Verse 6 indicates that the Assyrian deliverance hasn't happened yet. So this happens either shortly before or during the whole Assyrian crisis that we saw in the previous 2 chapters. Which makes sense. The ancients didn't always tell their stories in chronological order. They're not like us. They don't necessarily think in a straight line linearly. Sometimes they would go around to a previous event and talk about that instead. Actually, I guess in our modern culture, sometimes we see movies that are told out of sequence, and it's done on purpose, but there you go, boggles the mind. Hezekiah's illness, this is parallel with 2 Kings 20, verses 1 through 11. But again, there's a couple differences and alterations if you compare them, but they're basically the same story. Hezekiah is told that he's going to die. Hezekiah prays, and it's a little bit different from his prayer in the previous chapter, because he actually does talk a little bit about, I've done these things for you, Lord. I've, done these good actions for you. Hezekiah gets a response from the prophet Isaiah. 2 Kings 20 and verse 4 adds the detail that Isaiah hadn't even left the palace yet when the Lord's word came to him. And Isaiah says 3 things. First of all, you're going to get 15 years added to your life. Secondly, you're going to get deliverance from the king of Assyria, which we talked about. And thirdly, we have this sign, again, that will confirm what's going to happen. The moving shadow on the staircase of Ahaz. And it's really described in more detail in 2 Kings 20 in verses 9 and 10. Why are we having this whole business of the moving shadow or the moving sun? Some versions interpret it as a sundial, the moving sundial. But in 2 Kings 20, in verses... I'm looking at 1 Kings, that's why that's not right. In verses 19 and 20... Not 19 and 20. 9 and 10. Isaiah said, "This shall be the sign to you from the Lord, that the Lord will do the thing that he has spoken. Shall the shadow go forward 10 steps or back 10 steps?" So Hezekiah answered, "It is easy for the shadow to decline 10 steps. No, but let the shadow turn backward 10 steps." Isaiah the prophet cried to the Lord, and he brought the shadow on the stairway back 10 steps by which it had gone down on the stairway of Ahaz. So the idea is, you have a choice, Hezekiah, which one do you want it to be? And Hezekiah says, well, let's pick the harder one, where the sun has to actually move backwards to accomplish this effect. Now, the whole basic lesson that we learn from this, what does this teach us about God and his sovereignty and prayer and all that? He's the God of the universe, but what else does it teach us? Something about prayer. How God interacts with it. Huh? He hears our prayers? Well, that's nice. I'm hearing your prayers over there. He answers your prayers. But pray for something. No. What else? Jenna? He was being compassionate. Okay. What else? Well, so it's not just that he answers prayers. Some people want to act like God, He's, before the creation of the world, God made every decision about what was going to happen. And at the, nothing's going to be changed. That true? He can change his mind, but He's God. He doesn't change. Exactly. And what we do learn is that while God Himself does not change, He will change His decisions in response to human behavior. We might see another example of this in Moses on Mount Sinai, in Exodus 32, for instance, where Moses prays on behalf of Israel, and there's, God, don't destroy them. God says, I'm going to destroy them, and I'll make a nation out of you. And, God could do that if He really wants. But Moses prays on behalf of Israel, and God listens to the prayer of Moses and spares them. Gail, you have something? Yeah.
Jesus was praying. Please change your mind. Please don't make me go through this.
That's true.
If you will, if that's your will, then I'll do it. Well, how foolish would that be?
That is it's an interesting concept there. Jesus the fact that Jesus prays more than anybody else, you're kind of like, why would I want to pray to God? He knows everything I'm thinking. Well, that's not the issue. That was never the issue. It's not like, oh, well, I didn't know Hezekiah wanted to live longer. Well, no. But, sometimes you need to ask. It's like any relationship with somebody. You know what they want, but you need to hear them ask it. And while God does not change in His character, He does change His plans. He does change His actions sometime in response to human behavior. Sometimes God was previously going to spare somebody, and He decides to destroy them instead because they were cruel to Him or ungrateful in some way. And, contrary to the incorrect notion that God's decrees are somehow unchangeable, if you want to say that every decision of God is unchangeable, and there are people out there that try to act like that, then at some point in this discussion God is lying, because He says, no, you're going to die in verse 1, and then later He says, I'm going to add 15 years to your life in response to your prayer. And it's not, yes, Gail.
Asking and begging and asking.
Yeah.
Finally, you relented.
Go, yeah, just...
The moral of this story is the reason I told you to pray and never give up.
Yeah, exactly. Listen to God, Well, God listens to you, actually say something. That's true of an unrighteous judge. How much more is it true of God? Luke 18, I think, is where that parable is. Right. I'll have mercy on whom I have mercy. I'll have compassion on whom I have compassion. Exodus 33. And also Romans 9, where he quotes it. But, so the point of all of this is that God does change His mind on some occasions and in response to some human behaviors. Now, verses 9 through 20. Verses 9 through 20 are a writing of Hezekiah, king of Judah, after his illness and recovery. This is kind of a little psalm that he writes here. And you won't find this one in 2 Kings. This is unique to Isaiah. Basically what we've got here, Hezekiah's reflections on mortality and deliverance. But interestingly, there's something missing from this prayer that you would kind of expect to be there if he'd just been healed from an illness. We're almost out of time, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to read verses 9 through 20, and then we're going to conclude for the evening. A writing of Hezekiah, king of Judah, after his illness and recovery. I said, in the middle of my life, I am to enter the gates of Sheol. I am to be deprived of the rest of my years. I said, I will not see the Lord in the land of the living. I will look on man no more among the inhabitants of the world. Like a shepherd's tent, my dwelling is pulled up and removed from me. As a weaver, I rolled up my life. He cuts me off from the loom. From day until night, you make an end of me. I composed my soul until morning. Like a lion, so he breaks all my bones. From day until night, you make an end of me. Like a swallow, like a crane, so I twitter. I moan like a dove. My eyes look wistfully to the heights. O Lord, I am oppressed. Be my security. What shall I say? For he has spoken to me, and he himself has done it. I will wander about all my years because of the bitterness of my soul. O Lord, by these things men live, and in all these is the life of my spirit. Restore to me health, and let me live. Lo, for my own welfare I had great bitterness. It is you who has kept my soul from the pit of nothingness, for you have cast all my sins behind your back. For Sheol cannot thank you. Death cannot praise you. Those who go down to the pit cannot hope for your faithfulness. It is the living who give thanks to you, as I do today. A father tells his sons about your faithfulness. The Lord will surely save me, so we will place my songs on stringed instruments all the days of our life at the house of the Lord. All right, so we'll talk more about this little psalm next time in Isaiah 38, and hopefully conclude the historical section next time.